Oh, microphone. Right, microphone. Yep. Do, re, mi. Oh, do, do, do. Okay, where's my sound? There it is. Okay, there we go. Alrighty, so let's get going. We're talking youth and religion. Okay. All right, so what were we talking about last time? I don't remember. Okay, so I think we left off, last time we were talking about, the fact that according to Smith and Denton's research, our most religious youth, right, which is about 8% of the sample in that first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion, had some different life outcomes that Smith and Denton classed as better, right? More positive, much less antisocial, and all of those things. And we were going through the 9 factors, cultural factors, that they suggest probably play a role in this, right? So moral order, the fact that they tend to, okay, that's not important. The fact that they tend to, stick to a kind of more conventional, more traditional system of morality that emphasizes a bunch of things that are also valued in American culture, right? Self-control, personal virtue, that kind of stuff. Backed up by spiritual experiences that they have, and then that they have access to a whole bunch of role models, right? And again, I think what I sort of ended up stressing was that religious communities, unlike a lot of the other spaces that young people are in, are much more age mixed, right? There's a range of people of different age groups, from young adults all the way up to elderly people that they can connect with as role models. Okay. What was the sample size for the National Study of Youth and Religion? Okay, that's a good question. The sample size in the first wave is about 3,000 teenagers and their parents. And then as it went on, they tried to stick as close to that, like they re-interviewed the same people, but there was attrition because they lost track of people. By the fourth wave, I think they were down to somewhere around 2,200. So that was, it's a nationally representative sample for sure. Okay, let's clear that off. Okay, so community and leadership skills. Okay, this one. So what do Smith and Denton mean by community and leadership skills? Well, one of the things that they suggest is that those young people who are in religious communities are more likely, because of their kind of position, right? Because of the positions they have in their communities, to be sort of given roles, right? To be given roles within the community, things that they can do to help, things that allow them to, and I'm going to point 2 things together here, build things like cultural capital. We'll talk about cultural capital and social capital in a sec. But basically, they're given chances often to help out in various aspects of the lives of those communities, whatever it happens to be. Whether it's helping out with kids programming, helping out in a soup kitchen, whatever it happens to be, they have more opportunities than young people who are less active in communities, right? And here, I'm going to go back to a chart that was here. So these 2 numbers, right, kind of speak to this. How many afternoons and evenings per week are spent without adult supervision? And again, what we see is there's a bit of a difference, the lowest, right? So they're with adults and they're theoretically being given things to do in that time, right? So they're given a chance to practice, living in community, navigating community situations, and to practice leadership skills, right? They are given jobs and roles and all sorts of things that they can do. And you can think of this a little bit like, in a sense, you maybe heard of like Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hours rule. This idea that the more you practice something, right, the better you get at it. And those people who tend to excel in life have more practice and earlier. They get more practice and earlier. And this is sort of the same thing, right? What Smith and Denton are suggesting is that young people in religious communities tend to have more opportunities given to them to practice their skills as leaders in communities, doing things within communities. Okay, and I'll give you an example, and it's close to my heart. So this is like my daughter. So my daughter's 15. She might call me. She's really sick today. Not doing that great, so I'm like a little mad at myself that I'm here, but that's okay. I will survive my own guilt. But she, a couple of years ago, right, she went to a horseback riding camp, right? And it happens to be a Christian horseback riding camp, but whatever. And so she went the one year as a camper. And then last summer, she took horseback riding lessons there. Yes, she loves horses. I may have mentioned that once or twice. Loves horses. And now she's gone back. She went back last summer for 2 weeks as a camp counselor, right? So she was one of like the junior counselors because she was just 14, but she was given all sorts of stuff to do, right? So for one, her favorite week of the year, she got to work with the horses, right? So she was the one in charge of like grooming and tacking them up and doing all sorts of horsey tasks. The second week, she was actually put in charge of a group of kids, right? So she was one of the leaders who had to lead them from activity to activity, and this was their really young kids camp. But she got to take a kind of leadership role there, right? And she had an older, the other person in her group was an older person, right? Someone who's more like 21. I think that person was 21. But she got to practice her leadership skills. And, and again, maybe speaking to this point as well in my personal example, the kind of lady who runs this camp, the horse lady, her name's Amy, she's kind of taken my daughter under her wing and made her kind of like her little protege, right? So she gets invited to all of the horse training events, right? To help, like after Christmas, they had to get the horses used to being around people and being ridden again. So she got to go out to that. There was an event on Sunday where they were doing round penning, right? And she got to learn how to do round penning with the horses and all sorts of things like this, right? So she gets to practice these skills, and she's going to go back, she thinks, for 3 to 4 weeks this summer again as a camp counselor. So while a lot of other 15-year-olds are playing Fortnite or doing something equally useless, she's practicing these kinds of leadership skills, right? And the idea that Smith and Denton have is that when someone like my daughter, well, we'll hope, we have worries, but that's fine. There are always concerns. That when she goes out into the world, right, she's going to be better prepared to deal with like leadership situations and to navigate social relationships than someone who didn't have those things, right? Someone who's more in those camps where they're not around people as much and not being given those chances at young ages to practice. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Number 5, I told you this slide takes forever. I should like split things up on this slide. Okay, we're going to clear off all the doodles. Okay, coping skills. And like I said, I kind of have these 3 labeled potentially as the ones that are particularly religious. Because again, you could develop community and leadership skills anywhere. It just happens that there's these dense networks of relationships in religious communities that tend to, make this more possible. Okay, easier, more friction-free. Coping skills. How to put this politely? I'm just going to write it. Right? Stuff happens. Bad stuff happens in everybody's life, right? No matter who you are, something bad's going to happen, right? Someone's going to die. Someone's going to get sick. The struggles are real, right? And, you're going to have trouble in school whatever it happens to be. Now, what Smith and Denton say, and again, anyone can have coping skills, and there's all sorts of coping skills available. What Smith and Denton say is that religious communities, what do they offer, and religions offer in particular in terms of coping skills, is a lot of scripts. What do you do when you are faced with some particular difficulty, right? How do you handle the death of a loved one? What happens? Like, what are the expectations? How do you cope with the emotions that you're feeling, right, when someone gets sick, so whatever happens? Religious communities offer, and religions offer scripts, right? These prepackaged, prescribed ways of dealing with the fact that shit happens, right? Now, again, it's not that people who don't have this aren't able to deal with stuff, but again, one of the things that Smith suggests is that much of the coping, that happens, in the kind of secular world is sort of ad hoc, right? You sort of make things up as you go along, and you sort of figure out what the coping skills are going to be as the tragedy happens. Whereas, let's say if you're in a religious community, you slot into whatever that religious community sort of does to deal with, the hard stuff. I always think of the example here of like, Jewish communities, Orthodox Jewish communities. When someone dies in an Orthodox Jewish community, the whole community comes around the family of the person who died, and they do, it's essentially a tradition called sitting Shiva, right? Where the whole community comes around and people stay with this family. I think it's basically 24 hours a day for a 1 week period. They provide all the food, they provide comfort, right? The whole community sort of falls in to help this person deal with that first week after someone has died, right? And this is the sort of coping skills that it provides, right? Scripts, rules, how communities deal with things, rather than having to make it up on your own, or in individualized societies, right? And especially for secular people, having to deal with hard stuff by yourself with no community support. So there's a lot of coping skills built into religious communities. Okay. And again, it's not exclusive to them, they're just a little bit different. The truck is still here. It is still backing up all these days later. Okay, so cultural capital and social capital. So these are pretty common terms, right, that you're going to hear in the social sciences a lot. So cultural capital, right, is basically this idea that people have different levels of ability to navigate social circumstances and social environments in ways that get them positive results, right? That basically you carry with you a lot of skills that might allow you to navigate situations and help you, get out of the world what you're trying to get out of it. So things like manners, right? If you're a well-mannered, well-spoken person, you're much more likely to get people to help you, right? If you've had a chance to practice talking to people, and again, I want to stress the not age stratified nature of these communities, practice dealing with people of different ages, right? Asking them for things, presenting yourself in a way that's going to get them to help you. You have a much better chance of getting ahead in life, getting things like references, getting help from people, having people teach you things that you need to know. All of that is basically cultural capital, right? And again, one of the things that Smith and Denton say is that, and again, linked to these community skills, religious communities give a lot of age-mixed settings where you can practice cultural skills that allows you to develop cultural capital, right? You develop it really, really well. So that when it comes time where you need something, you need someone to help you, you know how to ask, right? You need a reference, or you need, help with something. You know how to ask, you know how to navigate, and you know how to get people to help you. Okay, so that's cultural capital. Social capital, a little different. So social capital is more who you know, right? Oh, I sent her McDonald's and she's now feeling better. Okay, so the crisis has passed. All she needed was a McFlurry and the crisis has passed. Okay, we're good. It probably didn't help that she wasn't feeling well last night and didn't eat anything. Okay, so social capital. All right, what do we mean when we mean social capital? Right, it's who you know, right? It's who you know rather than what you know, and how those people can help you get ahead in life, right? So it's social connections, it's social networks, right? And religious communities offer pretty dense, and the more cohesive they are, the denser those social networks are as well. So that when you're looking, let's say you're coming out of university or high school and you're looking for a job, right? Well, if you have someone in your religious community that kind of knows someone in that industry or is in that industry, there's a better chance that you then will be able to, basically find, I spaced on my own thought. If you know someone, right, you have a personal connection to them or, friend of a friend, you might have kind of a leg up, right? They'll often say, when you're looking for that first job, it's less, what you know than who you know. That's social capital, right? And religious communities generate a lot of social capital because people know each other, they care about each other, and they're willing to help people. And here, I'm going to give you a totally not Smith & Denton reference. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy, Robert Putnam. He wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone. Okay, and Bowling Alone is an interesting book. Basically, he was writing about the growth of cable television, of all things. Wow, that feels old. And how he felt that the growth of cable television had really undermined communities, right? Because what happened with the growth of cable television was that suddenly being at home was super entertaining, right? You now had 100 channels to choose from. So you basically, instead of, okay, how to put this? Boredom. Boredom is important. Because boredom motivates you to go out and do stuff, right? When you're really bored, you might go join a bowling league, right? Or a religious community or something, right? Because you want something to do, you want to be entertained, you want to feel good, whatever it happens to be. And so what Robert Putnam says is prior to cable television, we had all sorts of really dense networks of social connection built around all sorts of activities. The bowling league is sort of his example. And he says, when cable television comes on the market, you can see declines in all sorts of engagement outside the home. Because suddenly being at home is really, really entertaining, right? It's really fun. There's a million things to watch or do. Video games, like the NES and the Super NES and all sorts of things sort of come out around the same time. So suddenly the home is a really fun place to be. And we see declines in social engagement, right? And we see declines especially in social connections in the form of social capital. So one of the things that Putnam says in Bowling Alone, and again, this is written in the 90s, I believe, is that about 50% or half of all social capital in America, he figured, was being generated in religious communities, right? So people in religious communities had much better connections to other people who could help them get stuff. And this is what Smith and Denton are sort of pointing to as well. These dense communities, these non-stratified communities, give people access to all sorts of social connections that can help them in life. Okay. It's been 22 minutes and I'm still on this slide. I told you, this is a really long slide. There are way too many points. Okay, but I want to keep it cohesive, so it's all on one slide. This one. Okay, so I'm going to go back a couple slides. I'm going to circle a couple of numbers. So, I'm going to change pen color just so we're clear that I'm talking about something new. We're going to go with purple. Purple. Okay, so this number, these two numbers, right? Less unsupervised time. And then these two numbers matter tremendously. to what we call network closure. And what do we mean by network closure? Okay, so young people, A, they're unsupervised less. So bad stuff happens when teenagers especially are unsupervised, right? They do drugs, they have unsafe and unplanned sex that leads to teen pregnancies and all sorts of things like that. So, they get into trouble, they drink, they get into shenanigans, right? All sorts of crap. When kids are unsupervised, things go sideways pretty quickly in a lot of cases. So being unsupervised is, shall we say, suboptimal, right? Not the best. So they're unsupervised. Religious youth are unsupervised less, right? They have more time that they are supervised by adults, and there are more adults that are talking to each other and to their parents. So, rather than having sort of an open network where parents don't know what's happening with their kids, right? They're not connected to the adults that are also involved in their kids' lives. They have a much greater closure in that network where all the youth are unsupervised less, so more of their activity is monitored, and the adults are talking to each other and especially talking to their parents, right? So if little Cindy, I don't know why her name is Cindy, is having trouble, right? And you notice that, she's depressed, or you notice she's starting to hang around with that crowd of kids that smokes marijuana behind that patch of trees in the schoolyard after school, there's much more likely with a closed network that information is going to get communicated back to parents, and that parents are then going to be able to come up with a plan or at least address issues going on before they become serious, right? When things are small, easy to address, let's say someone starts hanging out with antisocial peers, not great. If you can address that relatively quickly, you can mitigate some of the harms that happen much better, right? So people won't tend to go into some of those antisocial negative behaviors that are potentially going to lead them down bad paths that are not positive. Okay, and my last one. Network closure is really important. I said less about it than other things, but I actually think if you were going to talk about one thing that's the most important, I'm going to say it's number 8. And extra community links, I think this is probably the least important one, but they have it there, so I'll explain it. Extra community links, Smith and Denton basically talk about religious communities are connected to other communities, right? So for instance, right, your church is connected to a Christian horse camp or something. So all these communities are connected somehow, right? And if your kid wants to go off and do something, like build houses for people in Guatemala or, serve at a soup kitchen, there's these extra community connections that link those groups together, right? Like I think probably every church in Edmonton is somehow connected to the mustard seed, right? And if you wanted to get involved in the mustard seed, guaranteed someone in a religious community knows someone who works there and will be able to get you involved, or Hope Mission, or whatever it happens to be, right? So these links to other communities that can allow you to do things that you want to do. Also, the other one, if you happen to move away, right, you move off, especially to go to college, and think of the US. This is a US study. US has a very go away to college kind of experience rather than live in the city you grew up in. Chances are your religious community can connect you with people in another religious community, so there's less of a gap, less of that moment of disconnection. Okay, I'm done with that slide. It took 27 minutes to finish points 4 to 9. Okay, let's continue. All right, so I'm gonna very quickly, again, I promise I'm not gonna bore you to death with charts, except that I'm gonna bore you to death with charts. I'm gonna go through this really quickly, and just to give you an idea, right, of the change of this kind of size of the groups, by the time that they were in their kind of emerging adult years, right? So now every part of the sample has kind of passed the age of 18. They're now emerging adults, moving into adulthood. The size of our most religious kind of emerging adults was down to 5%, and every other group had grown, except the regulars, down to 14%, so there are less regulars, but our sporadics and our disengaged had grown considerably. Okay, so what I'll say is, and I think I had this slide in the wrong place, bless you. The pattern kind of held, right? Some of the differences were smaller in this kind of second wave of the national study of youth and religion, but overall, the most devoted young people were still doing better than their peers, right? Okay, so I'll circle a couple of things, right? Oh, they got along better with their moms and felt extremely close to their moms, much more than their peers. Okay, they talk to their mothers more often, always good, right? Your mom likes that, talk to her. Give your mom a call if you don't live with your mom. Okay, they felt their mothers understood them. This is a huge gap, by the way. That one's pretty impressive. Less of them felt close to their fathers, less of them got along well with their fathers, but, overall, and less of them talked to their fathers and felt their fathers understood them, but it's still better than the whole the sample on the whole, and fewer of them had experienced parental breakups, right? So, most of them had gone into emerging adult life, again, it's 76%, so it's not 100. Most of them had gone into their lives as emerging adults, having come from kind of two-parent intact families. I already talked about this earlier in the course, all of the advantages that brings. And again, I'm going to erase that because you can't see the number on the slide. For our religiously disengaged, it was barely half, right? And 16% had gone through parental breakups, 2 or more times versus 11%. And not a huge difference, but it's definitely there. Okay. Social engagement, I won't over stress this. They're a little bit more socially engaged. 2.5 total number of organized activities involved that they're involved with. 2.5 organized activities. Sponsored by religious groups and not sponsored, right? The disengaged were not in religious groups at all. Shock. And then, but even in terms of our other activities, they were above the average. So that's that. And then we're less likely to be on social networking websites, which I think is good. Okay. Same thing with risk behaviors, right? They are, if we just kind of look at this column across the board, they're still the most risk-averse group in terms of behaviors that are going to cause you problems in life, right? Let's cite, where's binge drinking? Binge drinking, 3 or more times, frequency of alcohol binge drinking, 3 or more times in the last 2 weeks, right? Only 3% said they had done that versus 12, 24, and 25, and never binge drank, 16% versus frequency of never binge drank, 16. I'm reading the numbers. No, sorry, 90%. Sorry, I read the, 1650. That doesn't sound right. 90 versus 41, right? So they're much less likely to binge drink. So that is a thing. Binge drinking is really bad for you, as is marijuana use, right? Do they smoke weekly or more? None of them said they smoked weekly or more, and 98% of them said they had never smoked marijuana, versus, fully a fifth of our disengaged, and 15% of the sporadics who said they use marijuana weekly or more, and very many few who had said they had never done it. Again, marijuana is a risk behavior. It's especially in your emerging adult years and your teen years. It's super bad for your brain, so you shouldn't do it. You can do it once you pass the age of 25. Although I say this, I had a friend who decided he was going to start smoking marijuana at age 28. Thought he'd try it, and then it absolutely kicked him into a schizophrenic episode. So just don't smoke weed. Weed is bad. I'm like the guy from South Park. Marijuana is bad, okay? It's right. It's bad. Don't smoke weed. It has anyway. The science is not particularly ambiguous. It's shitty for your brain. Okay, has been in a serious fight more than once in the last 2 years. Right, 12%, which is still higher than I thought, but well below these other groups. Draw a quarter of our young people saying they've been in a serious fight in the last 2 years, and they're less. They're just more risk averse. They don't like taking risks compared to these other groups, right? Man, the sporadics love taking risks. Okay, super fun. Okay, all right, how many more do I have of these? Okay, I have 2 more, I'm sorry. I know there are a lot of charts and numbers, and you're like, charts and numbers, I hate those. Okay, physical health. Physical health, they rated as good or excellent, right? We're talking, better than 3/4 versus just over half. BMI in the normal category, 2/3 versus, half. And then, we see overweight, 1/5 versus better than 1/4. All these things, right? And they were less likely to be obese. Although the sporadics were doing good there too. Happy with their appearance, right? Very or somewhat happy. Less likely to be unhappy. So body image is a good thing. They plan for the future more. I won't circle those. Rarely or never feel sad or depressed, right? Again, almost 3/4 of them said they rarely or never felt sad or depressed. Less likely to feel life is meaningless. All this stuff, right? So, all good. Now, again, they'd experienced traumatic events about the same amount. So, weird. And they felt guilty more. They must all be Catholic. I don't know. What can I tell you? They never feel invisible, right? And are less likely to feel alone or misunderstood. So all sorts of things. And then our kind of life satisfaction numbers, and we'll come back to this, not this exact chart, but a similar kind of data when we talk about kind of mental health and loneliness. But what do we see in our devoted? Well, yeah, they're more likely to say they felt life was close to ideal. And this is a big gap, right? This is a 23-point gap between these two. And still, a pretty solid gap between the other groups. Feel that conditions of life are excellent, 18-point gap and an 11 and 12-point gap on the others. Satisfied with their personal life. This is an amazing number. 94% of them, felt satisfied with their personal life. Not huge differences, but still a 9-point spread on the disengaged. Have gotten the important things in life right. That's a big difference as well. And their average life satisfaction score, but well above the average, right? 14.6 was life satisfaction score. They were well above the average. So happier with life in general. Okay. So what's the takeaway? So I think the takeaway for me is the following, right? It's pretty obviously that the religiously devoted are different than other emerging adults. I think this comes down to, you can see that. I think this comes down to community, right? And the number of adults that they are engaged with, the kind of social connections they have that foster them into adulthood, right? And foster them into these really positive roles, help them when they're struggling, and all sorts of things. I think it's a lot of community stuff, which is why when I go back to this, I should have just used the selector. I think most of this is community. I'm going to write it in yellow because that doesn't show up well. Community. And the fact that are devoted, they're integrated into institutions, right? They're institutionally bound. Whereas I think when we look at the disengaged, they're disengaged, right? They're disengaged not just from a religion. They look like they're disengaged from a lot of other stuff too. They do less. They spend more time unsupervised. They take part in fewer activities on the whole, right? So they're more disengaged. They're less bound in with institutions. And look, I'm a functionalist at heart, right? I'm a Durkheim guy. I think I'm not a Marxist who thinks institutions suck, or a postmodernist who wants to deconstruct everything. I think institutions are good for people, right? We do well in institutions. Like, I'll lay my cards on the table. I think Durkheim is more right than Marx or Weber is, and the whole schools of thought that emerge from those people. I'm like, yeah, we do well in institutions, and we do well in functional institutions. And so people do well, and young people do well when they are institutionally bound in some ways. Now, that said, so I think those religiously devoted youth, why are they different from other emerging adults? They're just more supported, right? There's more social connections that are holding their lives together than the disengaged, right? So they don't fall into those antisocial behaviors. They don't do drugs. They don't drink as much because their communities prioritize against those things. Okay, so they did seem at this point in their lives to be adjusting to emerging adulthood better than some of their less religious peers. And I will say, I don't know that this is helpful, right? Because I've always said, you can't really tell someone, hey, just be more religious, right? And I don't think the religion is necessary. I mean, obviously, religious communities are unique in the sense that why do they get together consistently? Because they have a religious belief, right? They have a common cause. That's why I think they've endured where bowling leagues have fallen by the wayside, right? Because once you weren't bored, you didn't go bowling anymore, even though bowling alleys are still pretty busy and they make a fair bit of money. But that's neither here nor there. Bowling leagues aren't what they used to be, right? It used to be a really common activity. Religion is fading, but it's still there because it has this common cause. So religious communities hold together in a different way. But you can't just tell someone, be religious. And increasingly, it's hard to tell people to, be institutional. Because there are fewer institutions for people to belong to. So, I think and what I take away from this religion data, and we'll talk about some other stuff in a sec, is that young people do really well in these institutionally bound contexts. They are becoming rarer, though, and I think that is a big problem for young people. We're going to talk about loneliness in one of our upcoming topics. Relates to religion again, but this is as religious as this is going to get, and the same point is going to be made, so don't forget. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm a terrible time manager. I'm sorry. I get excited about this stuff and I get all sideways. Love the religion stuff. It's like my favorite unit. Which is why it's late in the course, so I can save something wonderful for March. Okay. So, I want to talk a little bit about Gen Z, and there's one particular set of ideas that I want to present because Gen Z, I think, is a little bit different in their religious orientation than millennials, right? So we're talking about millennials, right? We talked about moralistic therapeutic deism. We're going to talk about a different idea when we talk about Gen Z. One thing I wanted to note, though, and this is kind of interesting. This is our kind of breakdown of Gen Z. This information comes from 2021 from a research institute called Springtide Research Institute. They're an American research institute, I believe based out of Colorado, and they do a bunch of research mostly on young people with a really strong focus on religion. So every year they put out a report. This year's was on religion and politics, and it wasn't as exciting to me, but that's something else. I'm tired of hearing about Donald Trump, and I didn't want to read a whole report about Donald Trump, so I didn't read all of it. But they're really interesting, and their focus is on young people. This was a pretty small sample they did. It was about 1,900 young people in 2021. They've expanded this to like 15,000 in their latest waves. Okay, what did I want to note about this slide? Because I think there's something interesting here. More and more young people are calling themselves just Christian, right? So it's this category here, this dark blue. The largest proportion of young people who call themselves Christian are calling themselves just Christian. Now, what does that mean? Okay, and why is that important? Just Christian, I take, and this is Ryan Burge's take as well, and he's knows this kind of quantitative data on religion in the US really well. And he takes this to be that this just Christian category is a category of deinstitutionalized Christianity, one that is no longer linked to these big denominational groupings like, Protestant, Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, whatever it happens to be. So it's deinstitutionalized in a lot of ways. It's dehistoricized. And so if you ever run into the kind of term, if you're interested in religion, and you run into this term for, spelling is hard. Non-denominational, right? So you run into a church that's non-denominational. This is essentially what you're at. You're in a deinstitutionalized religious space. So even amongst religious people, deinstitutionalization is growing, and people aren't linked to big, long historical traditions. So I think that's interesting and important, and it just kind of shows, right? Okay, and how I just have to remember what Ryan was talking about when he talked about this just recently. I think he said something like, no one under 30 knows what a Protestant is. And this might be a slight exaggeration, but I actually take it quite seriously. No one under 30 knows what a Protestant is, right? When you're talking about Christians, if they're not Catholic, right? Catholics still know who they are, kind of. If they're not Catholic, they're broadly identifying as just Christian or part of a non-denominational church. If you want to see the growth of the nons versus mainline Protestantism, you have to come take sociology of religion with me. I can't do it here. It's too big of a debate. But we're seeing a deinstitutionalization even in religion, and that has consequences. Okay. And Gen Z has a very different attitude towards religion and spirituality than past generations, right? They're deeply disconnected institutionally. And they say things like, 58% of them will say things like, I don't like to be told answers about faith and religion. I'd rather discover the answers on my own. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a very kind of individualized, unique kind of way of thinking about it, right? The whole point of religious traditions is to tell you, sorry, I giggle. The whole point of religious traditions is to tell you the answers about faith and religion, right? That's what a religion is. But increasingly Gen Z, and right, think back to Jean Twenge here, talking about this trajectory from the boomers to Gen Z, right, as individuality growing, getting bigger and bigger over time. So Gen Z, religious communities try to fix their problems instead of just being there for them. Half of them say that. So really interesting attitudes. Okay, couple more things. This is just like, again, this is that same data, right? They don't like being told answers. They don't believe some. So why did they not turn when facing uncertain, difficult times? Why don't they turn to religious practices or turn to religious communities, right? So they don't agree with everything the religious communities teach them. They don't like being told answers. Other things help them find meaning. They don't need a faith community. They don't feel like they can be their full selves. That's an interesting one. I'll talk about that in a sec. In faith communities, so half of them say that don't feel like they can turn to religious communities, say they don't feel like they can be their whole selves. Religious communities try to fix them instead of just being there for them. This one, right, 53%. Religion, faith, or religious leaders try to give you answers, but they're looking for something else. Religious communities are rigid, restrictive. That's not helpful. Is there another one here that's useful? They don't need it. Religion is about certainty and doesn't welcome uncertainty, doubt, or asking questions, right? And down the line, right? So you can read the rest of these things. I think, a lot of this points to a growing individuality and a growing sense of deinstitutionalization, right? They're not turning to institutions for answers. They want to find the answers on their own on some kind of journey, which is what it is. There's also a values gap, right? Gen Z feels like they care about things differently than the religious communities that are around them, right? No surprise here. They think they care more about LGBT rights than their... So, sorry, the chart. So the top one, the light green, is how much they care. The dark green is how much they think their communities care. And the orange is the gap between them, right? So on all of these, LGBTQ rights, they see a 27% gap in how much they think their communities care, right? Gender equality, a 25% gap. Immigration rights, a 23% gap. Income inequality, a 23% gap. Disability rights, 22%. Environmental causes, 22%. So basically all of these are above 20%, right? in terms of like they think they care a fifth or a quarter more than their religious communities do. And the only ones that are below are Black Lives Matter and gun rights or gun reform. So even then, it's still double digits. So they perceive a big gap in the values that they hold versus their religious communities. I'm out of time, aren't I? But I have so many slides left. No, 3 slides left. Okay, I can't do 3 slides in 2 minutes. I got way too excited. We'll finish this on Friday and we'll move on to the next topic. And I don't remember what the next topic is, but we will move on to it. I'll figure that out before Friday. Okay, so we'll talk about flourishing, right? So again, we can connect this to National Study of Youth and Religion in some ways, because it's a similar kind of question. How well are our most religious youth doing? So we'll talk about that on Friday. We'll finish the 3 slides I've got left. Don't worry, this one will take me almost as long as the 9 cultural points. So, we can enjoy staring at this slide for a long time. We'll see you on Friday.